This is the Royal Victoria Country Park by the shores of Southampton Water. A park with 200 acres of wood and parkland, a miniature railway, tea rooms, and this beautiful chapel. Somewhere that I've visited many times when I had two young boys, and only recently have I come to discover that this place plays a significant part in my family's history. The story starts 15 miles that way on the southwest tip of Hayling Island, home of the Sinar Heavy Anti-Aircraft Battery. During the Second World War, my grandfather, Henry James Haskey, was posted here with the 219th Battery of the 57th Wessex Heavy Anti-Aircraft Unit, and on the night of the 17th of April 1941, his life changed forever.
Henry was born in 1911 in Marylebone, central London. His childhood wasn't easy. His father, my great-grandfather, William Haskey, was a private in the Middlesex Regiment, 20th Battalion, and died on the 12th of April 1918, aged just 34, when his son Henry was only 7 years old. Henry probably never knew his dad, as his father was sent to war when he was just 3 years old. In April 1935, he married Rose Ellen Wilson, my grandmother, and they spent many happy years together. Henry worked as a railway porter before being called up to fight Nazi Germany.
The Sinar Battery here on Hayling Island was armed with four 4.5-inch naval guns. Each one was mounted in the centre of these concrete gun positions. From the air you can see that only 3 of the 4 positions still survive today. They were protecting 2 airfields, Tangemere in Sussex, which had Spitfires and Hurricanes, and the base of the Flying Fortresses near Reading. The guns were only allowed to fire in a certain arc. Targets out of that arc were left to fighter aircraft who dived down with their machine guns. When they succeeded, they would swoop over and do the victory roll. Dogfights were a common thing to watch from here.
It was the night of Thursday, 17th of April 1941. Just hours earlier, Yugoslavia had surrendered to the Germans, and bombing raids on the UK were becoming more frequent. Only the day before, there had been a devastating Luftwaffe raid on Belfast.
The time was 8 p.m. and the sun had just set, and the Luftwaffe were on their way to the south coast. Before the night was out, 150 enemy planes would have dropped over 100 tons of parachute mines, high explosives, incendiaries and flares. The attack was brutal. My grandfather Henry was operating the sights of one of the guns. They would take it in turns, sat inside the thin metal box mounted to its side, turning the dials to position the gun before each shell was fired. After some time at the site, it was Henry's turn to swap with a member of his crew. He climbed out of the gun and went to make the tea and get some more shells from the ammo store about 30 metres that way. Henry heard a bomb falling from the sky. The order came for everyone to lie down. Those who weren't scared stiff threw themselves to the ground. Henry raised his head and caught the blast. The explosion completely destroyed Henry's gun and killed all of his crew. Henry was instantly blinded in both eyes as shrapnel entered his body. That night, the guns fired over 2,000 shells and brought down 5 bombers. But sadly, 6 men died, with many more injured. At this point, the story gets a little sketchy, which is hardly surprising. Bombs were still being dropped. It must have been chaos. We know that ambulances were sent, more than one, because the first one had been hit by an incendiary. On the ambulances were voluntary aid detachment VAD nurses from the Royal West Sussex Hospital. One casualty was reported as saying he remembers seeing dead bodies laid out as he was taken to the ambulance. Whilst being carried, he saw a parachute mine hanging in a tree, and one of the nurses commented, "Thank God we got past that." Henry's injuries were serious. He was completely blind. He had a compound fracture to his left arm. Covered in blood and oil, he was taken to what was the largest military hospital in the country, the Royal Victoria Military Hospital, Netley. And the hospital was on this site. Queen Victoria, aided by a friendship with Florence Nightingale, commissioned the build. She laid the foundation stone, and living less than 10 miles that way at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, she was a frequent visitor to the hospital.
Today, there's not a lot to see. Only the chapel remains. But when it was built in 1863, it was the world's largest military hospital. And at 1/4 mile long, it was also the world's longest building. 138 wards, 1,000 beds. During the First and Second World Wars, the hospital was extended even further to its rear, with many huts to accommodate 2,500 beds. It's not clear how Henry arrived at the hospital. Casualties either arrived via shallow boat to a pier that was once here, or via the hospital's very own railway station, just to its rear. You can still see the railway tracks. It would have been via this railway that my grandmother, Rose, would have first visited Henry soon after the bombing. Fortunately, Rose was staying nearby in West End, Southampton, with her Aunt Jane, so was able to visit quickly. Rose and Henry had been struggling to start a family, and just prior to her visit had found out that she was pregnant. Henry didn't know, and she was advised not to tell him, which can't have been easy.
During that first visit, Rose found Henry still covered in blood and oil. She wasn't happy and raised the roof. Not surprisingly, on subsequent visits, he was properly cleaned and bandaged. His injuries were multiple. He was still blinded, and his broken arm was weighted and hanging at the side of his bed in an attempt to straighten it.
During his time here, his eyesight improved slightly. He remembered seeing a flash of a red cross on a nurse's uniform. When he left the hospital, his eyesight improved a little more. He continued to work on the railways as a goods porter, undertaking light duties. The railways were very good at taking on the war wounded who couldn't work elsewhere. Henry and Rose had 2 children, Marion, my aunt, and Barry, my father. In his later years, Henry's eyesight deteriorated quite badly. When he retired, he was supported by St Dunstan's, now known as Blind Veterans UK.
Henry died on the 18th of April 1986, too soon at the age of 75. For me and my family, he was a war hero, a very modest one who, when asked if he was angry that he'd lost his sight, he simply said, "How can I be? I was the only one of my crew who survived." So that's my family's connection to this beautiful country park and the newly refurbished chapel, which contains fascinating insights into the hospital's history, with exhibits, displays and photos. It's well worth a visit, and you never know, your family could also have a connection with this historical place.